Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to this session on an intro to D3, wherein we're going to look at some wild data visualization. So the agenda for the session, we're going to start quickly with some goals, what we're going to try and have achieved by the end of the session. We're going to then jump straight in to look at what is D3 for those of you that don't know or haven't used it or seen it before. We're then going to elaborate on that and look at what's possible. And to do that, we're going to explore the wild side of D3 and some of the visualizations that you can create with it. We'll then wrap up with some next steps and some takeaways from the session. So my background, my name's Kevin Bluer. I'm a developer and instructor. I've got over 10 years in software development in a variety of different roles within a number of different companies, including Microsoft, The Economist, and a lot of consulting for a lot of startups and a number of other larger organizations. And I pretty much develop across both the front end, so usual web stack, so HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and also do a lot of back end development as well. Typically, or most recently, with Node.js, MongoDB, etc. I've also done a fair bit with Microsoft.NET, although less of that recently. So the goals of the session, we're going to look at how you go from this, which is a very mundane, pretty much as mundane as you can get from a visualization perspective, to this, which is kind of the opposite of that. And we've got a kind of rich mosaic of visualizations there, and some pretty wild stuff, as you can see. More specifically, the goals are to come away with a basic understanding of what D3 is. It's a visualization language for those of you who've never seen it or heard of it at all. Also where you should use it, and also where you shouldn't, because it obviously, like any technology, has some really powerful things you can do in certain areas, but it's not for every use case. Also look at the kind of potential that it's opening up for this concept of enhanced storytelling, and we'll look at a couple of examples from the New York Times and others that are sort of starting to adopt this concept. And hopefully the kind of final one is just to take away to be more inspired to explore D3 further and maybe use it in your own projects or applications. Okay, so jumping right in. So what is D3 and why should you use it? So the acronym itself, D3, stands for Data-Driven Documents. And it's a little bit of a play on something, or an organization called the W3C, for those of you who have heard of that, which stands for the World Wide Web Consortium. A little more succinctly, it's basically a magical chunk of JavaScript code that helps you express data visually on the web. So really, at its most core, it's literally just a single JavaScript file, or with additional ones that you can plug in, which that kind of undersells it pretty heavily. And most broadly of all, it's a library for creating data visualizations. You saw a couple of those a few slides ago with the kind of rich, colorful visualizations that you can create with it. That's just scratching the surface. I mean, we'll see some examples shortly. And most importantly, it renders in a browser. So it's a web-based framework. Obviously, as I mentioned a moment ago, it's based on JavaScript, and it complements and builds on top of usual suspect web languages, including HTML, CSS, and in its core, and we'll get to more of this, it uses vectors. It can use the canvas and other things as well, but it kind of leans towards using SVG, which stands for Scalable Vector Graphics. Its origins, it came to being in 2011, and it was the kind of logical successor to ProtoViz, which was another visualization framework created by the kind of same guy or his team, which was similar but not kind of didn't allow you to kind of directly work with the DOM, which is something we'll explore in a moment for those of you who know some web stuff already. And the main kind of driving force behind it is a guy called Mike Bostock, who's a pretty awesome fellow. And he's obviously got a few folks around him, or had a few folks around him when they started on D3. And since then, because it's an open source thing, there's a huge community that's kind of grown around the technology. And so it's no longer just the original folks, but Mike's the kind of obviously the original author and the kind of spiritual force behind it, as it were. Where is it used? In a lot of places. This is just a kind of sampling here. GitHub, for those of you who use GitHub, it's used there on some of the visualizations on the site. The New York Times, as I mentioned earlier, use it pretty extensively, and they really are ushering in this concept of kind of storytelling through data, and we'll see an example of that. And then a bunch of other companies, including Square, Recorded Future, if you've heard of those, and literally tons more. It's really grown in popularity and use across many sites and applications. So what it does, jumping in a little more technically, there's a little bit kind of a workflow behind which the piece of JavaScript will work in the way in terms of the sort of various steps. So first of all, it will begin by loading the data into the browser's memory. As I mentioned before, it's a browser-based technology, a web-based technology that runs in the browser. So it starts by loading in the data, and that can take in a number of formats. For those of you who've heard of JSON, it kind of typically will perhaps be the kind of core data type that it would work with, but it can work with XML, it can work with CSV, TSV, and a bunch of other formats. Then it will bind that data to elements in the DOM, and the DOM stands for the Document Object Model, and it's basically a representation of all the elements that make up the page, starting kind of with the body of the page, and then you've got various elements within that. So that could be text, it could be containers, it could be images, it could be tables. So D3 will bind the data to those elements, and then you can basically transform the data upon bind and give it additional visual properties. So you might be binding them to vector-based elements if you want them to kind of float around. We'll see some some cool stuff in a moment. And then you can respond to user input. So it's not just a kind of static visualization, although it could just be that. But you can respond to user clicks. As the mouse moves around, you can do all these kind of fancy things that obviously make it a much richer experience. And unlike Protoviz, which, as we mentioned, was the predecessor, it has a bunch of other kind of things going for it. So firstly, because it works in the way just described and works directly with the DOM, it makes for a lot more simpler debugging. You can just open up the console in the browser and kind of step through the code and do all these kind of just traditional browser-based things, which is fantastic for those of you that do web development. And that lends itself to easier experimentation and greater visual possibilities, because it's just purely a browser-based kind of framework. It doesn't force you down any path. And the slight downside or challenge with that is because there isn't any real out-of-the-box visualizations, unlike other frameworks and libraries, has a slightly steeper learning curve associated with. But as we don't get into too much code in this session, but it's pretty shallow, and there's tons and tons of examples out there, so it really doesn't detract too much. Okay, so what it doesn't do, which is just the reason I put this slide in, is just to kind of give the counterweight, so you can obviously see some of the great things it does do, but also be aware of perhaps where you shouldn't use it. So or just some of the caveats as well. So it doesn't provide out-of-the-box visualization. So really, in its core, it's just this one file that you would plug in to your page. That's a very powerful file, so I don't want to undersell it, but it doesn't kind of give you any WYSIWYG, step-by-step visualizations. There are frameworks that build on top of it that do that. So don't panic if you're looking for something that lessens the learning curve. There's as I mentioned a moment ago, there's a lot out there. It also doesn't support older browsers. So the author, so Mike and the team, when they came up with D3, decided to literally just standardize it upon HTML5 and CSS3. And that keeps the code base a lot cleaner and leaner, so they're not having to kind of put in hacks to support older browsers and older versions of both HTML and CSS. So that gives us the framework a good baseline to build upon. It doesn't work with bitmaps, as I mentioned briefly earlier on. Its primary kind of target for anything visual is vectors. The beauty of those is the kind of speed of rendering of them, and also the scaling of them. So if you were to scale up to say like a 4K screen or down to a phone, it would just scale seamlessly, and you get full fidelity across the board. Unlike if you're working with bitmaps, which would start to pixelate depending on the size, the original size of the image. And lastly, it doesn't actually hide your original data, given it's all running in the browser, and like as I'm sure you will know, you can view the source. you can kind of essentially drill down and pull, see where the data was coming from. It doesn't kind of abstract or obfuscate that from anyone. But I think the kind of premise behind that is if you're building a visualization to share essentially data in a visual way with someone, then you're of course by virtue of doing that exposing some of the data. So, but still an important caveat nonetheless. Another quick kind of positioning slide here is that it's a explanatory tool or kind of product than an exploratory. And what I mean by that, an exploratory tool or framework would be something that you'd use to kind of derive and discover insight from data. So you've all heard, no doubt, of this concept of big data, where we're kind of experiencing this exponential growth in data. So if you were trying to comb through that and mine for insight, you wouldn't use D3. You'd be using other languages and technologies and tools to do that. Listed a few up there on the slide. Conversely, once you've derived that insight and were then looking to present it in a great way, then you would use D3. Now, there's some caveats to that. This is not quite as black or white as perhaps I've just made it, but definitely D3 is the kind of visual end of the data set. That's really where it excels. So again, just to position it and see where, make you aware of where it fits in the kind of overall stack of things. Okay, so that's it for the kind of positioning. We're going to now take a quick look at what's possible with D3 visually. Obviously, it's a visual thing in itself, so I don't want to bore you with any more text-based slides. So let's jump right in and take a look. So this one, and just kind of before we actually look at some actual real D3, is just kind of to flag that there's lots and lots and lots of examples out there. One of Mike Bostock's kind of founding principles, I think, as a technologist and certainly an author of a framework, is that people learn by doing, and he's put literally probably hundreds, probably even thousands of examples out there. And this grid up here was actually taken from a slide or presentation that he put out there recently, both kind of on that concept of the importance of examples. And that's really been one of the keys to its success. So I've got two kind of buckets of examples here. So first of all, we're going to look at storytelling. I've mentioned that a couple of times as something that D3 really helps with, enabling you to not just put that silly, ugly, boring chart that we saw at the start out there as your visualization, but doing something a lot more richer and and in doing so, telling a story. And then we'll also just look at some of the kind of data analysis possibilities, which are typically a little more mundane, but D3 can handle those as well. And we'll look at a few from GitHub, which obviously is a great product in its own right. Okay, so as mentioned, there's this trend towards storytelling. It's also referred to as data-driven journalism, and as I mentioned, the New York Times really is one of the pioneers of this, and that's actually where Mike works. So let's jump in and take a quick look. So the first example I've got is something called the Wealth of Nations. This is kind of just a pretty typical, I wouldn't say typical, but just good example of D3, and it's telling a little more of a story than just being static charts. So on the x-axis there, you've got income per capita, and on the y-axis you've got life expectancy, and hovering around in the middle all these countries. I think that's the United States in the very top right there, and basically as the slides, or as the time's going by, as the decades are rolling by, the countries are increasing in size, which is represented by the ball, and then obviously they're moving along, in most cases in terms of along the x-axis to with the income per capita is increasing and life expectancy. Typically most countries are going up and to the right, and as you perhaps expect, given the US is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, that's most further along in both directions. And you've got, and if you actually hover over, you can see we go Brazil, Mexico, etc. So a great kind of somewhat simple but powerful example that takes it beyond just a kind of static chart and gives a lot more, and that you could easily add in like a slider to move it, allow people to move it backwards and forwards, and maybe do a little more on positioning, flag instead of the color for the country. But instantly gives you a good taste of some of the possible things. And this is just to stress, this isn't Flash. This is just running in the browser. It's using vectors, so it looks nice and sharp. And just your typical web-based languages, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So all simple, relatively simple stuff. Okay, so next up is an infographic from a photographer um, who has done a, or sorry, I should say a visualization from a photographer who's based it on an infographic. And he's just, pretty simply done a breakdown of, I think, all the, or a subset of his photos and broken it down by the camera that he's used to take the images and then the type of lens, and you can sort of interact with it, which is pretty nice. And then he's done the ability to kind of toggle um, again on the variables of the EXIF data taken from the images, and you can see, and it moves around. So pretty simple again. Again, you'd be surprised it doesn't take as much code as you might think to do this behind the scenes. And it makes for a much more compelling thing than just something static, embedded in a web page or in a PowerPoint or whatever. Okay, so next up, and this really is looking at or embracing the concept of storytelling through data. This is I think a great example, and a bit different. This is actually live on the New York Times' website. It's from an excerpt from, I guess, some content they put out there from the Fashion Week in September of last year. And as you move over the different shots of the models wearing the different clothes, you can obviously see kind of how cool and interactive that is. And you've got trends, I think, or observations along the bottom or below the images. And again, same thing, different designers, pretty cool. And a great way to kind of consume this content. This could have easily just been a grid of like thumbnails of the images, but instead you've got a lot more insight. And if you click on them, which I won't do now, you go into more detail and so on. But again, one thing I also want to point out is if you notice the author, it's a team of five folks, including Mike Bostock, who, as I say, is the original author of D3, and he's no doubt working in conjunction with probably one of the fashion reporters, a photographer, etc. So moving beyond just your typical siloed role into something that teams worked on and come up with something like this, which I think is pretty awesome. Okay, so now we're looking at some of the kind of data analysis potential of D3. So going a little more traditional, but in a with a different flavor on it. So these are all I've just pulled out 3 different visualizations from GitHub. So this is a contribution to the number of commits that you've made over the span of a year. And they've got a nice visual way of seeing it. So rather than just being perhaps a line graph or a bar chart, you've actually got a little grid, and the color represents the number of commits in a day. So a commit is basically pushing some code into a repository or a project essentially that you're working on. And the more is better typically if you're a developer. So again, a simple but different way of representing the data there. This one's again a bit more traditional. This is just commits over a time to a particular project, and you can see how the group has done. Everyone, if there's multiple people working on a project, and then individuals. So there's myself on the left and another colleague that I was doing some work with. See a little bit more from me there, so I've been a bit more productive. just kidding, but that you can see, and that's useful for perhaps a manager or whomever that's making tracking productivity of a team. And the last one is a punch card. So it's again similar information but conveyed a little bit differently. And all of this is very easy and made possible with D3. As I say, there's lots of examples and framework or the built tools in the framework to make this very easy. Okay, so we're nearly there. So just to kind of get as we kind of close out, just listed out some tools and libraries and extensibility concepts around D3. So first of all, there's this great playground out there where you can just see the code in a visual way and see the visualization that the code generates. It's a great way to actually learn. And in the interest of time, I'll kind of skip over actually showing it right now. And then there's also a increasing number of libraries that build on top of D3. So that's taking the current functionality and extending it in some pretty amazing ways. And I've been speaking to people that have been using these recently, and got particularly Rickshaw by Shutterstock, the stock photography company, that have also open sourced a framework that builds on D3. And then finally, D3 plays nicely with other libraries. So things like Backbone and CoffeeScript and Three.js, because it's basically just a web language, it plugs right in and can just work very happily with these other tools and frameworks and libraries, as I mentioned. Okay, so that's it for the content. So next steps. I would suggest using the playground. If you do a search for D3 playground, you'll find that, and that's a great jumping off point just to kind of wade in and see, dip into the code. Check out the galleries that are out there. There's many galleries. If you do a search for D3 gallery, or if you go to the repository on GitHub, you'll see a huge list on the wiki that they have up there. NVD3 is a framework that actually provides some really nice, simple ways and kind of WYSIWYG style editors for D3. Fourth, get to know Mike Bostocks, either face to face if you can. If that's a bit tricky, then you can obviously just follow him on GitHub and Twitter and do a search for some of his presentations. He's a great guy, and you'll learn a lot by seeing what he's up to. And then just generally check out the tutorials. There's a lot out there, and in the same vein as the playground and the galleries. There's lots of kind of good step by steps out there if you do a quick search. So all pretty easy and accessible. So that's it. So that was a quick intro to D3. So hopefully now you've got a flavor of what's possible and been inspired to look beyond and perhaps even consider using it in your own projects. And feel free to reach out to me anytime. I've put my email address up there. It's kevin@bluer.com. So thanks for listening, and look forward to hearing from you. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.